Thank you very much. I'm extraordinarily honored to be here. And I want to thank the university here at Stellenbosch and in particular Ashiel Mbembe for his extremely gracious invitation. This is my first time in South Africa, and I must say that I am less sure about what I have to offer you than I am sure about what you are offering me already. My sense is that my work, my thinking will already change by virtue of what I have seen here and the conversations I've had here. And my guess is that that is, in fact, not uncommon for people who theorize from elsewhere and have not come here. I don't know what precisely the relation is between theory and location. But what I do think is that those of us who work in the domain of theory put out certain kinds of schemes, certain kinds of grids of possibility. We work in certain ways with concepts and with texts, and we offer them to audiences we do not know, and they sometimes travel to locations we've never been, and other things happen with our theory or in convergence with other kinds of theories that we neither control nor predict, and that's precisely the way it should be. So I'm always somewhat alarmed when people say, oh, do you agree or disagree with that appropriation of your work? Because it seems to me that the work is nothing other than a field of unexpected appropriations, and who am I, finally, as author, to run after my work and say, no, you can't say that. I mean, I try to reel it back, right, so that it still belongs to me. Although, for instance, I myself am sure that my locatedness in the United States inflects my work, perhaps even pervades my work, I also trust in the transposability of the work through languages and locations, and that if it were not for that transposability, I would not actually enjoy or learn from the world in which the world that I inhabit as an author. It's my sense that theory is put into the world and others read it or don't. They use it or abuse it. They appropriate it for their own purposes, and it becomes something else, and necessarily so. And that is a good thing, because something alive is then put in the world, and it travels and changes. If it cannot be appropriated, if it meets an impasse somewhere, if there's no receptivity, that's also a sign. It tells us something about how the work remains perhaps too tightly bound to the site of its origin, or to the parochialism of its epistemic limits. I wanted, just for those of you who don't know my work very well, or maybe only have entered it for one purpose or another, just to try to give a little bit of a understanding of my trajectory. For those of you who do know my work well, you know that I am very terrible at giving an account of myself, and the failure to give a good account of myself is actually very important to me. I actually value that failure, and I'm quite sure that others could give better accounts, and that I would be the last person to be able to judge their ultimate value. People ask me, how did you move from a theory of gender performativity to a consideration of precarious populations? Okay, it seems Judith Butler, gender performativity. Actually, I started with Hegel, but we'll just let that be for a moment. Is there a link between the concept of performativity and precarity? The political question if it's posed as a political question, is a bit different, and I would suggest perhaps more fundamental. People say to me, it seems you were once concerned with queer theory and the rights of sexual and gender minorities, and now you are writing more generally about the ways in which war designates certain populations as ungrievable. But I want to suggest to you that although it is true that my work in recent times has become more concerned with issues of precarity, I am approaching that issue in the first instance to try to find a different kind of ground for alliance among the subjugated. We can't really use the word minority so easily, since minorities are usually housed within national frames, and the subjugated are sometimes expelled from national frames, right? So trying to find a word that might retain some generalizability here. And I want also to suggest that I'm interested in alliances, which was, for me, from the very first, a characteristic of queer politics, in order to understand how left alliances might work, not that overcome difficulty and antagonism, but that work in the midst of difficulty and antagonism, where the idea of an eventual resolution is not as important as the idea of being able to mobilize together in and through difficulty and antagonism. So for those of you who have followed the history of queer theory or queer activism on this continent or others, you may know that some of its earliest formulations were based on the idea that queer is not an identity. I mean, people do say, are you queer or are you queer? But I think when they say that, they don't always know what they're asking or saying. It's possible to say, and even to say with pride, and still not to know exactly what is being communicated. Queer was a term for me that came into being as a verb, to queer something, to take it off its straight path, to do something different with it, to establish a detour, but also, as my former colleague Yves Kosofsky-Sedgwick made clear, the queer activist movement had to be anti-homophobic, but it did not mean that you had to affiliate or identify necessarily as gay, lesbian, bi, and that the whole point of the activism was not to ask for anybody's identity card, that the identity card was not the condition of admission, but rather the commitment to an anti-homophobic agenda, and in particular, an AIDS activism that involved demanding affordable drugs and funding educational projects that would help to inform people and function in whatever way as a precautionary, as a set of precautions against contracting the virus itself. It seems to me that given that HIV did very quickly and has still now, especially on the continent of Africa, affected so many different populations, it became crucial to establish alliances between the poor, sex workers, queer people, understood in whatever way, those who used drugs, those who were the victims of blood transfusions, and that were improperly tested, and that the kinds of alliances that have emerged around HIV prevention included anti-homophobia, but were not exclusively focused on that, as as targeted populations have clearly shifted over the decades. So, on the one hand, I want to say that precarity is a concept that might operate as a site of alliance among the subjugated who otherwise do not always find much in common with one another, or between whom there's sometimes suspicion and antagonism. If I try to answer the questions that are posed to me about performativity and precarity, I think I'm forced to say that there are modes of agency that are possible within conditions of precarity, and how might we go about identifying what they are. Okay. Precarity is a condition that people suffer. Precarity means that one is exposed to illness or unemployment or violence, and that one has insufficient resources available to solve or address those problems. Performativity has to do with constituting a certain kind of self in conjunction with others, a certain practice of the self, a certain way of elaborating one's political agency in an embodied way in the world. Okay, the term performativity is taken up, it's taken over, it's let go. Its meaning is not defined or stabilized by those who give it new theoretical formulations. The term means something new every time it is actually theorized, which is why I think there can be no definitive theorization of the term. In fact, the term is repeated, and there is a reiterative effect that the term has. And I would even suggest that given how many people have used the term has unwittingly created a set of unwieldy and interesting alliances. Precarity is an historically variable condition of life. It became important as a central and animating concept for the anti-globalization movement, as a signifier for feminist anarchists in Madrid, the precarias a la deriva, as a concept in new economic analysis, especially neoliberal, that links concerns with food distribution networks, the politics of shelter, the stateless, refugees, the poor, and those differentially exposed to social violence, and the lack of legal redress and prosecution. If we try to tell a certain story about how performativity relates to precarity, it's only to explore a set of domains that one does not so much make as explore with others. Both engage an ongoing set of histories. They're not only on purely conceptual grounds, but also embodied in practices and institutions and in non-institutionalized modes of living. They raise questions about the conditions that are necessary for persistence. At first, I understood performativity to be an account of agency. And it emerged out of the theory of cultural construction. If I am culturally constructed, am I still able to act? Or is the fact that I am constructed, does that imply that I'm determined, or that I'm already made, or that I'm effectively driven by forces that precede me and that are larger than me, and that this I is helpless and impotent in relation to those forces. And I sought to say no, that indeed we are profoundly formed and shaped by cultural norms, but that the I who emerges to negotiate those norms or to develop a critical reflection on them is at once the effect of those norms and also a form of agency that can change the trajectory, the future form of those norms as they invariably repeat themselves. And as I reflected upon precarity, it seemed to be a condition that characterizes threatened life. It indicates the limits of anyone's control, and so we might even say the limits of agency. But let me suggest to you that implicit even in the idea of gender performativity we can see where precarity enters the picture.